Hello, APCSA. Ms. Thompson here, and we are going to talk right now about the class header. So I want to remind you about the last activity that we did in Nearpod, where you were exploring at least 3 different simple Java programs. I took screenshots of 3 random programs in there, so you may have seen these, you may not have, you may have looked at some other ones. But I want to draw your attention to the starting line of every one of these programs. So this one right here that says public class binary converter. This one here that says public class scanner and keyboard. And this one here that says public class array examples. Each one of those lines, which hopefully you notice look very similar to each other, is called the class header. And the class header is like the very first official line of code in any particular program, and it follows a specific pattern. So the first thing you should notice is it always starts with the words public class. I want to make sure you realize those are lowercase letters. Public and class are lowercase. Public designates the class as being visible or accessible to other classes. It means that another class could come in and modify some aspect of it. And so it refers to it being accessible outside of the particular class. Now, we will learn about the keyword private later on in the year, and you can set something as private, which would then mean that that particular piece, class, method, variable, whatever, would not be accessible to other classes or be able to be modified. So there's times when you want to use private instead of public, but for now, everything that we're doing, we're going to use the word public. Okay. And then class designates the hierarchy of the code at the class level. So when we look at the overall outline of the structure of a program, notice we have the definition of class here. Now, there's the level of interface, so setting something as an interface or containing it within an interface. That's another level. We'll learn about that later. Package and import statements. Most of the time, we're going to be importing the utility, the Java utility. Most of the classes that we use are contained within there. But for instance, maybe you're going to do something with servos, and so you need to import the servo library. Or maybe you're doing something with statistics, and so you're going to import a statistical visualization library. So there are lots of other libraries that or packages that you can import and have access to classes that other people or organizations have written within Java. And then below the class is what we would call the methods. And the main method is required. Every class has to at least have a main method, but you can have multiple other methods under the main method. So for now, we're only going to be using a main method, but eventually we're going to start writing additional methods that will help you understand the purpose of the main method. But for now, we're just going to stick with the main method. All right, so the class header has to start with public and class. And then after that, it should have an identifier. The identifier is basically the name of the class. What are we calling it? How do we refer to it? And notice it starts with a capital letter. Every class begins with a capital letter, and just like we learned last year in CSP, your identifiers should give you some inkling to the meaning or the purpose of that particular chunk of code. So this particular class, it involves the scanner and the keyboard. So the name of the class is actually not the only class that's referred to in this particular program. Notice scanner starts with a capital letter, system starts with a capital letter, and so does string. So this method here, this main method, is referring to the scanner class, which essentially looks for data to input. The system class, which accesses different user interfaces. In this case, it's printing out on the console. And then the string class, which is essentially how the instructions for how the computer encodes text and the different things that you can do to manipulate and analyze text in the data or the array that's been set up. So this particular program refers to four classes, but the only one in the class header is scanner and keyboard. But we can recognize the other classes because they have the capital letters. Now, there are some other capital letters in here, like enter and hello. Those are not referring to classes. Those are referring to texts that are being printed out. So you can always tell that those are text outputs or inputs because of the quotation marks. Those always will designate strings that you're interacting with, saving, printing, things like that. So not to be confused with class names or identifiers there. All right, so finally, a class header should always end with the open curly bracket. So for example, in the same program we were looking at earlier, this bracket says everything after this is part of the class or is included in the programming for the class. And the computer will keep reading all the lines of code until it comes to the closing bracket. So this means that all of the code in here is contained in the class, and that's all the code in the class. There's no additional code. You also see that here in the main method. This bracket opens the method. This bracket closes the method. So it's telling the computer everything after this curly bracket or these 4 lines of code are in the main method. We close it here and then we close the class. So to summarize here, when you're looking at the class header or making your own class header, it needs to start with public class. It will always be followed by an identifier that starts with a capital letter, and it should end with an open curly bracket indicating everything after this is part of the class until you get to the closing curly bracket. So the next activity that you're going to do is to look at some class headers and decide which of them is correctly formatted and which are not.